Good afternoon, everyone. So just noting that it's 1 o'clock, we'll get started, just keeping everyone's time in mind, but we'll let people in as they arrive. So good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Beyond Part of the Job, Building a Reporting Culture to Protect Municipal Public Works Staff. My name is Kelly Elliott, and I am the Executive Director of the Association of Ontario Road Supervisors. Thank you for joining us for the third day of National Public Works Week with the fourth of 5 webinars that AORS is pleased to bring you this week alongside some of our fantastic partners. Together, we'll be discussing important issues impacting municipalities and public work professionals across Ontario. As we have all this week, I want to begin by taking a moment to recognize and thank each and every one of you for the impact you have on your communities across the province. The work of municipal public works professionals often goes unnoticed, and when it is noticed, unfortunately, it can sometimes come in the form of negative feedback, which we'll talk about today. The reality is that your work is often thankless, but our communities simply cannot function without you. From maintaining critical infrastructure and protecting our environment to ensuring safe roads, reliable services, and healthy communities, the work you do matters immensely. You truly are the public works superheroes of your communities, and National Public Works Week is an opportunity to celebrate and recognize the incredible contributions you make every single day. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, Sandra Lowe, an executive coach, HR professional, skilled facilitator, and one of our AORS phenomenal instructors within our Public Works Leadership Development Program. Sandra empowers leaders to realize their full potential through exploration, self-awareness, and growth. She's a catalyst in leadership development, a trusted consultant, and an executive coach dedicated to unlocking potential and driving transformation. With over 15 years of leadership experience in the public sector and more than 20 years in human resources, she brings a wealth of expertise to every engagement. Sandra's academic credentials further cement her expertise, holding a Bachelor of Science in Psychology, a Master's in Workplace Learning and Change, and a Diploma in Public Administration and Leadership. With a commitment to mastery in leadership development, Sandra completed her graduate certificate in executive coaching at Royal Roads University. As a certified human resources professional, Sandra has navigated the complexities of the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors with tact and agility, leading strategic initiatives that drive real results. She is renowned for her strategic vision, collaborative leadership, and exceptional ability to unite people in solving complex challenges. Her mastery of communication, stakeholder engagement, and facilitation ensures that every interaction leads to clarity, alignment, and meaningful progress. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Sandra. But just a reminder before we begin, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to put any questions into the chat throughout the webinar, and I will monitor them as we go. Additionally, this will be recorded and shared with everyone who registered. So Sandra, the floor is yours, and I am going to share my screen with your presentation. So just one moment here.
Thank you, Kelly.
Hoping everyone can see that.
Yeah, thank
Perfect.
you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Sandra. Thank you so much, Kelly, and the team at AORS for having me as part of your webinar series this week. As Kelly mentioned, I've worked with AORS for a number of years now on the Public Works Leadership Development Program, so I'm excited to be here in a slightly different capacity today, and thrilled to support today's important conversation on this topic. Our hope is that you will walk away with some tools to use and also questions that you can bring back to your teams and your municipalities to help foster this reporting culture that we're going to talk about today. So, Kelly, next slide, please. All right, thank you. Next slide. So AORS, if we go back to the agenda. So as you know, across Ontario, municipal public works professionals are facing increasing incidents of abuse, harassment, and public interference. And many of these situations go unnoticed, unreported, and not examined. We want to be able to support you to help and strengthen workplace health and safety, engagement, and well-being. AORS has been conducting a survey of its members, and I'm going to share some of the early results here. Knowing what these workplace incidents look like, the impact that it has on your people is an important first step in building the case for change. we're going to close our time together talking about some strategies that we can use to bring back. And as Kelly mentioned, we're going to have some time for a Q&A today. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at this. As part of AORS advocacy work with the province on addressing workplace violence, harassment, and incivility against public works leaders, AORS has been connecting with various folks at the province to help advocate for legislative changes in support of your profession. The province has asked for data to support these calls for legislative change. And so here's where the first challenge comes up. The challenge is that in many cases, this data doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist in a really robust way to be able to paint a strong picture. So AORS set out with this survey to this spring, and I'll share some early results here with you about what we're starting to see. The data that you're going to see over the next couple of slides is based on the first 100 respondents or so. I think we're up closer to 130, 140 now in terms of responses. So let's take a look at this. Here, respondents were asked to identify what kind of incidents were happening to their employees. Over 80 out of 100 respondents stated that incidents were happening, that they were aware of these incidents happening to themselves or their team members. And these are the items that they had selected in terms of what was actually showing up. What you'll see is over 80 people were talking about verbal harassment, yelling, and threats of violence as being the most common, sort of many people responding that that was happening. With a close second, over 60 people or 60 indications of filming or taking photos in a confrontational way. A close third comes up to online harassment and physical interference in our staff's ability to do the work. So this is just a snapshot of the data that we're starting to see, but we'll start to take a look at some more specifics as we go on. When you look at these issues, though, or these incidents, you might start to consider them in sort of a spectrum of very severe and violent to less so. Another way to look at it is this model on the next slide. So this model is another way of looking at how incivility behavior shows up in the workplace. Anderson and Pearson proposed that all of this behavior, so whether it's just being incivil and impolite, to the most aggressive and violent behavior, all falls under this sort of bucket of antisocial behavior. And there's overlaps within that space. So when you think about when we're talking, having this conversation about workplace violence and harassment and incivility in the workplace, many of you will be familiar with your organizational policies that will have very specific definitions about what meets the threshold for harassment and what meets the threshold for violence or discrimination. There's also a whole lot of stuff that happens that would fall under incivility, where repeated over time and time again becomes a significant stressor in the workplace, but may not hit the thresholds of that policy. So it's important that we have the ability to talk about, how all of this behavior is connected, and is something that we need to pay attention to. As well, regardless of the source, internally from amongst our teams or across teams or between colleagues and between leaders and employees, or externally from members of the public to contractors working for the city, or maybe just contractors doing other work in your municipality. All of these kinds of behaviors have a negative impact on organizations, teams, and individuals. Next slide, please. Of the respondents who said that their teams had experienced these kinds of incidents in the workplace, over half of them said that these occurred occasionally. And here, what that meant was a few times per season. And about 10% of respondents saying that these incidents happen weekly or more. Please keep in mind, though, that frequency doesn't necessarily tell us about severity. So you could have incidents happening once, maybe twice a season, but it's very severe. The conversation today is about how we build a reporting culture. Change in culture is about a person deciding to do something different. It's about how people show up individually in their behaviors and attitudes. So when we start to think about what we can do differently, I'm curious, do you have this data for your organization? How could you find that out? Do you have a real sense of what's getting reported and maybe what's not getting reported and why? We're going to dig into this a little bit further as we go through this conversation this morning. When we look at why these incidents don't get reported, next slide, please, Kelly. Respondents were asked to select from some options about why reporting doesn't happen. So some of these were pre-populated, and then there was another sort of bucket called other that folks could select. Many of us have heard of these before, and AORS, the AORS team has heard from this, heard about these sort of groupings from members as they've traveled across the province and engaged with you through local association meetings, trade shows, and training and so forth. These are many of the same beliefs or concerns that we need to address in order to build a reporting culture. And one of the most concerning things that you can see here is a significant portion of people felt that incidents were not being reported because this kind of dealing with that kind of behavior is perceived as just part of the job, or maybe it wasn't serious enough. Or a belief that nothing's going to change or there's not going to be any action taken. So, why does this matter then? Next slide, please. In addition to our moral and ethical obligations to take care of each other, and we have our duties and obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, respondents reported that these incidents have led to a significant increased stress and anxiety on their teams and challenges recruiting and retaining qualified staff to support their teams. Now, in our Public Works Leadership Development Program at AORS, I've had the opportunity to meet with many public works leaders across the province. And I've heard from many folks over and over again about how hard it is to find, to recruit really great talent and to be able to hang on to those folks. Not only just from a succession planning perspective, but even to get your numbers in place to simply deliver on your mandate from your municipality. These incidents that we're talking about are contributing to our people these valuable resources walking out the door. So we're seeing increased use of sick time, staff asking to work in other places or moving to other departments, and or leaving for other opportunities where they think it might be easier. When we look at other research, next slide, please, Kelly. So there's broader research as well with respect to the impact of incivil and unjust behaviors happening in the workplace and how that translates to what we see in the business. These kinds of behaviors like harassing, abusive, psychologically aggressive workplace behavior, and physical violence, of course, all lead to lowered job satisfaction, lower satisfaction with their own leaders, decreased organizational commitment, more of an interest in looking for other opportunities. You might actually see increases in retaliation behavior, aggressive aggression, greater absenteeism, people leaving, and less commitment to the organization. So those translate into very real impacts in terms of how the individual shows up in the organization. As well, next slide, please. When we start to see psychological conditions such as stress, depression, and anxiety being experienced by our employees, we start to see productivity and performance declines, decreased job satisfaction, increased lateness, tardiness, absenteeism. Your sick numbers go up, so they're absent from work, trying to replace them, and costs associated with that, as well as increased turnover. And finally, next slide, please. Often, stress-related health problems, so a lot of those issues that are causing stress and anxiety in the workplace also start to contribute to these health-related problems such as heart disease, migraines, and ulcers. And when employees start to experience those things, we see even further reductions in employee productivity. You're going to see, you'll start to see more disability claims against for your organization, and people will start to withdraw from participating in the organization, whether it's through absenteeism, turnover, early retirement, and other exits. So there's a lot of very real impacts on the organization, team, and individuals in terms of how the stress and anxiety and this behavior and incidents that can happen can impact your work. So then, if we know that these things are causing negative workplace impacts, so then what we need to focus on is how do we start to maybe reduce their frequency and severity? Is it possible to eliminate them? Let's take a look at some of those things. Next slide. When thinking about complex issues that we face as leaders, sometimes it's helpful to think of three frames or views to about how that comes together. So how this issue comes together for us and what we think and do in that situation. The first frame is philosophically, like what do we think and believe about the situation, the roles, what assumptions are we making? The second frame is around internally. What am I thinking? What do I believe? What does my experience tell me about what's going on here? And there's also an external frame or viewpoint to this, where it's like, what are the external pressures or expectations and things that we have to, that surround this issue that I have to deal with? In this situation, one of the things that comes to mind from a philosophical perspective is assumptions or beliefs that people may have around these three things on the screen. So, and when I say people, I mean a lot of different folks. What does your team believe? What does your municipality believe about these things? What do members of councils think? What do the members of the public think? So they may have a variety of different perspectives, and it's important to be attuned to that because that's one of the things that you'll be confronting as you start to think about how do I work on this issue. For example, what are the beliefs about the role of the public servant? Is the role of the public servant to do whatever the public tells them because the public pays their bills, right? Like I pay your salary, so you have to do it the way I told you. Is it around, you know what, council gave us this direction and council's going to have our back, and that's a new service level for our municipality, and we have to enforce that. So, what are some of those beliefs around this role of the public servant that exist around this? What are our appropriate customer service standards? When I started out in my career, way long time ago in retail, the idea that the customer was always right was very much front of mind. And I think I've bumped into folks over the course of my career who continue to believe that the customer is always right. And if that's the case, then at what point do we say, here's the boundary and you can't treat our people like that? So that's an important thing to be aware of. Again, like what does your organization think about that? How does council perceive that? How are they going to respond to these kinds of issues? And finally, historically, what has the culture been like from a public works perspective? What does it take to be successful in a public works career? Do you have to have a thick skin, get over it? You can't be so sensitive about those sorts of things. Is it just part of the job and that's the reality of it and we need to deal with it? We need to really think about how do these beliefs show up in the expectations about how we're going to behave and perform. If culture is about who we are and what we believe is important, these kinds of things will start to shape that. Next slide, please. So you'll recall I talked about three frames, another being sort of this inside frame or these inside voices. You may have had some of these thoughts running through your own head. You may not, or you might have shared some of these ideas with others. Being aware of what your inside voices are saying to you about these kinds of issues will help you when you need to look at how you're showing up for your team. When we start to think about what the organization requires and how do we start to shift some of the discussions. Finally, something that I think many of you will experience on the next slide, sort of all the outside voices and direction and inputs that are driving your work. We have to meet the budget constraints. Many of you are going through budget submissions right now. We have to do more with less. Service levels are getting higher. We're not necessarily getting more money from a budget perspective. Stay in your lane. Here's the project plan. You have to stick to that. We can't necessarily creep out of that or, step into somebody else's lane. How do we even engage with external parties? Do we have mechanisms for some of that? How do we build those relationships and address concerns? In some cases, this idea that, well, they're just going to complain to council and that might start another process over here. And we also have these obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and a Human Rights Code that are telling us how we need to behave as leaders and individuals in the workplace to ensure employees are safe and healthy in the workplace. So all of this noise is happening around us. So when we think of that context, sort of people's beliefs and assumptions, what's going on in our own mind, and then all these pressures within the organization and surrounding us. Let's take a look at the next slide and the reasons why people don't report. I was having a bit of a conversation with Kelly just before we started today, and we're saying, I was saying, I feel like this digging into the root causes behind this could take us well beyond an hour. And perhaps something to consider in your own municipalities. So, when we look at why people aren't reporting these kinds of incidents, so why aren't our employees reporting it? Many of them believe the incident's not serious enough, or the incidents are happening too frequently, or we're too busy to be able to do anything. Nothing's going to change as a result. We're talking about an external party. How are we going to influence them? The resident's not going to move. They're going to keep living there. So how do we change? How do we address that? And in some cases, there's a fear of consequences. The fact that the employee is concerned that the situation is going to escalate, or they may actually get in trouble, or scrutinized for reporting the incident. Now, building a reporting culture means that we want to foster an organizational environment where reporting these kinds of issues, concerns, and providing feedback is encouraged and normalized. This shows up if our goal is to build this reporting culture, then we need to encourage employees to provide feedback even when we don't want to hear it. And we need to start to think about what are the attitudes that show up on the team when people start to provide feedback or bring those kinds of issues forward. How are people reacting and what does that look like? And what kind of behaviors happen? So when somebody needs to report, how are people actually acting and engaging? They say that change would be really easy if it weren't for the human beings involved. So, and culture is all about how human beings and their attitudes and behaviors show up. So it's really getting clear. We're going to talk about policies and processes and some other things, but it's identifying those human behaviors and how we're showing up for each other that really starts to change and shift culture. Next slide, please. An example of a framework and a way to look at this is the chart on the screen. And what I would encourage you to do is consider taking, sort of the axes of the chart. So the columns down where it says the elements, so communication, training, technology, and feedback, plus the three columns on along, so current challenges, strategies for improvement, and expected outcomes. And take this back to your municipality and then populate it for your municipality. So when you think about your team or you think about your municipality or your public works department, what are some of the current challenges that you might be having with respect to training, with respect to communication, as an example? What do you want to accomplish? Like, what are the expected outcomes? We want employees to know how they're supposed to be how the process works. We want them to be more confident in dealing with this. We want to shape public perception of roles, perhaps. So the data that you'll see on the chart sort of within this table speaks about specifically around reporting processes and what opportunities might exist there. I think the overall framework, however, is a helpful tool to go back to your municipality and consider, how do we start to shift things in this? And the one pause on this that I would suggest is really starting to think about what are the expected outcomes. Many of us as leaders, and I know many of you on the call, are successful in the positions that we have often because we're really good at solving problems. It's really important, though, that we're clear on what is the problem that we're trying to solve and what do we want to have happen as a result, because there might be different ways to get there. Next slide. When I think about this idea of reporting incidents, one of the things that comes to mind, and if there's anybody here from one of my classes with the leadership program, I apologize if you've heard the story before, but it's related to this, it's a story around an organization that said that they wanted to land or have zero health and safety, like zero workplace accidents. And so they put the sign up on the wall and they start to track, how many accidents they have. And whenever, there's a period of time where they have zero accidents, then, there's these huge celebrations. So the goal that they articulated was that they wanted to have zero accidents. What the unintended result was, however, was they were actually celebrating not reporting incidents. So what actually happened is it wasn't that there were no incidents happening in the workplace. It's just people had learned not to report them so that this celebration could happen at the end. So when we're thinking about the measures we want to implement in the workplace to address this, this isn't about, I don't want to hear about it, I don't want to know about it, so it didn't happen. We actually need to surface this and start to determine, themes and how do we really get behind this. Part of that is what's called sort of going upstream. So let's go back sort of and think about getting ahead of these kinds of incidents. Is it possible to help shape a future where there are less issues to report? It's not that people are hiding them, but there are genuinely less issues to report. And what kind of things could we change to influence that early on? A couple of the measures that you could use, or your organization might leverage, is around public education, partnering within your organization, and partnering across emergency and enforcement services. One of the things that the AORS survey started to identify, and there was a number of responses from participants in the survey, that public education is a significant opportunity to educate the public about service standards and plans, So what are the schedules? What are the standards that happen across the board? To communicate expectations about staff and public interaction. So how do we expect you to conduct ourselves when you're dealing with municipal staff? And also, and importantly, is if members of the public have feedback to provide, how can they do that in a productive way? What happens if they interfere with operations? What are the health and safety risks? And what are going to be the consequences? There's a huge opportunity there for public education to happen throughout the year, not just during National Public Works Week. Within your organization, there's also a tremendous opportunity to partner. How are you sharing data, not only within Public Works, but even across departments? I know that AMCTO, so the Association of Municipal Clerks and Treasurers, recently did a survey as well on incivility in the workplace. And they were talking about the kind of data that they get and the issues that they bump into. I know from some of my work with the with fire services is that they bump into these kinds of issues, maybe a little bit differently than how Public Works does, but we do get data. So we should have data on, are we having frequent flyers? Do we have consistent practices when we're dealing with contractors who go offside? Do we have consistent practices in dealing with members of the public when they're threatening staff or harassing staff? So there's tremendous opportunity to partner across your organization and build that overall organizational support for these kinds of things. Finally, there's the opportunity to partner with emergency services and enforcement services. So whether that's bylaw or other enforcement functions within our municipality, some of these folks get information about whether it's, particular houses that have, there's they've been threatening, whether it's bylaw or public works staff or anybody who shows up within, a distance of their house and they start to threaten, like, are there flags and things or patterns that we can start to identify that might require a more fulsome municipal response to a location, and how we're going to engage with folks. So there's some definite work upstream that we can do to help get in front of this and plan ahead. Next slide, please. There's a number of organizational levers that we can use as well. And I guess I'd dig on training a little bit more. I know that many of you provide a lot of training to your staff already. As part of their onboarding, usually there's some health and safety training where we talk about workplace violence and harassment. We might talk about customer service. But in some cases, we'll actually provide training on de-escalation. So if we're interacting with someone, and I guess I'm curious, like, have you or your teams, like, does your organization have this specific conversation with people about when to call 911 or when do you call your supervisor? How the reporting process works when we have these incidents where we have these threats happening? What happens when these kinds of issues happen? Is somebody going to be trespassed? Are we going to report it to the police? Might they be charged? How do we set up our staff's expectations about what are some consequences here for the resident or the person who has, been treating them this way? And as much as, I'm a huge fan of training and do a lot of it, just because you sat in a classroom or read the notes or looked at the slides doesn't mean you actually learned anything. So having the conversation with people and understanding, do they actually know how to do this work, is important. One of the things that I'll just bring back from the AMCTO survey was that they looked at the difference between new hires or folks who'd been with the organization for less than 6 months versus various tenure. And what they found was that in their responses, many of the new employees who'd been with the organization for like less than a year, let's say, did not know if the municipality had any sort of standards in terms of customer service, but in particular, about how customers were to treat staff and if there were issues, what that process looked like. There was this gap that they identified that we were missing that in terms of new employees. The new employees were so overwhelmed with just trying to figure out their jobs that they didn't necessarily make that connection on what are the protections in place in terms of how I might be treated by members of the public, as an example. So when we think of training, don't think of all of your audience in the same boat. Think of, those specific groups, whether it's new employees, students that we have coming in, might they have different needs, and how do we support them? Another organizational lever is around our policies and processes. So, how easy are those to navigate? Can people actually find the forms? Do they know what needs to happen next? There was an organization I was working with, we were looking at violence and harassment, and there's like a specific form you're supposed to fill out. Um, I couldn't even find the form. So I had access to like their internet and all the things, and I couldn't even find the form. And what we found out was that the form was attached to like the back of a policy, like in one PDF. So it wasn't identified or tagged like as a form, like with a label or anything that was searchable. So it was only if you looked at the policy could you find it. You couldn't actually just search for the form itself. So I'm curious, and one of the things we started to see, actually it showed up a few times in the AORS results, is some people saying that their organization doesn't even have a process for reporting these incidents. So maybe that's a spot for an opportunity. When we think about data, what data are we collecting? Who's responsible for looking at all of the data for the organization and starting to capture themes and patterns? What are we actually doing with that information? And when we think about complaints going to members of council, how are they likely to respond? Are they supportive or maybe jumping to conclusions? Members of council have a responsibility under the Occupational Health and Safety Act for employee health and safety as well. So I'm curious about how that shows up when these kinds of incidents are reported. And have we had a conversation with council about what that could look like? Again, an opportunity for a conversation with your leadership team about how we're engaging with members of council on these kinds of issues. And finally, community education, and I've spoken a little bit about that. I think an important piece is understanding in the community the consequences for interfering with operations. That seems to be a significant trend that has been appearing. And maybe, municipalities can look at what are the things that we can do when people start to interfere in operations. Next slide, please. And while we can talk about conversations at the leadership table, and how we can troubleshoot as a leadership team and look at our policies and processes, it's also important that we're reflecting on how we're showing up. When this kind of complaint comes forward, how am I reacting? Um, it's important we're really listening to understand what's going on, and not rushing to make any judgments about, whether somebody was antagonized or whether it was provoked or is this the same resident again. So let's really try to understand the information so we can address it appropriately. When we think about helpful responses, next slide, please. The kinds of things that are helpful then are making sure we're taking the time to hear their perspective, tell them what's going to happen next, identifying these hazards. Maybe there's a particular neighbor or there's a particular contractor that we know has been a challenge. So we're going to ensure that people are going out in pairs, right? So there's opportunities. We have a responsibility as an employer and as supervisors to identify hazards. I tell our staff about those hazards and then provide training and supports to help, manage those hazards. So if we're bumping into these kinds of incidents in the workplace, Those are hazards that we need to make sure we're addressing. We want to talk about how, specifically about how to handle being recorded. What if somebody's holding their camera up in front of their face and videotaping you or trying to take their photo? Have that specific conversation about how you want the employee to react. We want to make sure that it's a priority and have a plan for when a supervisor might intervene. Next slide, please. On the topic of, being recorded and having somebody, sort in your face, it's interesting. I've been part of a lot of customer service training. I've been on the receiving end and delivered, and I don't know that maybe it's evolved in the last couple of years. I don't know that we've had a lot of conversation about what happens if somebody's trying to record you in public. Um, and what could that look like? So there may be maybe a bit of homework for our folks here on the call is go back and take a look at your training and your policies. Do you actually have specific training on what your expectations are of staff when somebody holds a camera up in their face? Our results, or AORS results, suggest that this is happening significantly and very regularly. So, how do you want your staff to be able to respond? I've got a couple of slides with some instant examples or suggestions here that you could take back. Now, the context that's important, and this is also a piece that's important to have the conversation with our teams about, is around expectations of privacy, and how that interacts with, our code of conduct or other municipal code policies. Generally, public servants can be photographed or recorded by the public while performing their official duties, particularly if they're in public places, service counters, and those sorts of things. This doesn't mean staff are entirely without rights or expectations of privacy, because that still applies to personal items. Filming can't obstruct lawful operations, and there's limitations on that. But the idea that public sector employees shouldn't typically have an expectation of privacy while working in open public facing government spaces isn't, I don't know how often we talk to our people about that. If that is, in fact, a reality for your municipality and your staff, that is a valuable conversation to be had so that we can, make decisions. That's where, as we go through our conversation, you'll see that engaging with whether it's your legal advice, looking at your policies from a privacy perspective, around being very clear about what those privacy entitlements are so that people are on the same page. As an example here on the slide, in terms of best practices, remaining calm and professional if we can, focusing on the work, setting boundaries, so respectfully and politely asking the person to move out of your personal space, and also protecting confidential information as well. We go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And it's important that we understand what organizational policies are in terms of public versus non-public places, what recordings can look like, how we take the ability to take photos, whether it's in parks, transit, government lobbies, those sorts of things. What are the privacy rules for your municipality? And, when there are issues that happen, how those might get escalated. Important to have a conversation with our employees about this so that they can understand what that looks like, and we can help manage expectations too. Finally, next slide, please. With respect to being videotaped or having a camera in your face while you're working, if photography is blocking access, intimidating other citizens, we can ask the person to leave or move. If it starts to become more of a concern, withdrawing from the situation, advising your supervisor, calling 911, reporting these incidents to management so that it's documented and we have a record of that. And also leveraging internal resources. These situations are stressful, difficult, And, when we look at some of the feedback from the AORS survey, there were a few examples where people had talked about a resident following them back to the yard and confronting them in the yard or in their office, where it's clearly indicated no public allowed, or a member of the public confronting a public works employees when that public work employee was like off on their own time and had their own child with them. So these kinds of situations can be extremely traumatic, stressful, upsetting, anxiety inducing, and it's important that we're taking steps to protect ourselves. So where do we start? We've talked about a number of different issues. Next slide, please. And if we move to the next slide, thank you, Kelly. So I'd suggest we start off where you are. That's usually a great place to begin. And look at what's happening in your municipality, within your department. What data do you have? What's missing? For that reporting process, somebody new coming in, could they figure it out? Do the new supervisors know how to document that? How do we support them through learning that? What is the message to the public about how to treat staff? Officially, do we see the signs on the walls? I've seen signs on many a community center or town hall. I'm curious about what happens to our vehicles or when our folks are working out in our parks or trying to deal with a water main break. What is the messaging, or how do we put those frameworks out there? And then unofficially, when complaints do happen, what are we saying? Like, is that consistent with the message that we've been, sort of stuck on the wall or on the side of trucks? Um, do people know what to do when faced with these kinds of incidents? When the camera's in their face or somebody's threatening them, do they actually know what to do when faced with these incidents? I think those are important questions to start with. And then what we want to do is, if we're building a reporting culture, what we really want to do is to build some incremental change. When you think about running a marathon, we run a marathon one step at a time. We want consistent effort over time, not just huge effort at the outset that's going to die off quickly. We need to start shifting the conversations in our organizations. This is not just part of the job. This is a workplace hazard that is having a negative impact on people in our organizations, and we need to address this. So raising these kinds of questions to your CAO, your HR team, privacy, legal, how do we manage reporting? What data are we collecting? How are we dealing with repeat offenders? These are really important conversations to have, and the foundation is around some of those beliefs that we talked about. Have a process that makes it easy, and thinking about how we're collecting and using data. And as we shift these conversations, we want to start to think about, how do we create time and space for reporting? Everybody is so busy, so busy. And I know many of you don't shut off the phones or the emails. Like, they don't stop at the end of your day. They just keep going. So how do we create the time to be able to manage this reporting properly, to be able to have these conversations? In my mind, it's a cost of doing business. These are hazards that our employees have to deal with, and we have a responsibility to address that. So we have to figure out the space to do that. It is time consuming, but we have a responsibility to do this. These conversations can be challenging, right? So why are people afraid of reprisals? Well, there's a whole lot that could be behind that. And so those conversations can be challenging in an organization. Sometimes having a facilitator can be helpful to get at some of the views and perspectives, and some of the reasons may vary based on the municipality that you're in. But if you at least start having the conversation and creating the space to shift that culture in terms of encouraging people where providing those kinds of that feedback is encouraged. That's what we want to start to see. Next slide. We're stronger together. You're not alone in this. You do not have to fight this on your own or deal with this on your own. Within your municipality, across the leadership teams, across your own teams. Share what you know, not only about the processes, but what kind of incidents and things are we seeing? Talking about what's working, how is the training supporting our teams, or what did we change in our process that made it so much easier? And how can we support each other? Using associations like AORS and others to share ideas across municipalities. That is one of the most wonderful things about the public service is you do not need to reinvent the wheel. There are folks who are in the municipalities that are right beside you or even further away who've dealt with this same issue and might have some tools and resources that could support you. You do not have to develop this from scratch. You've got other leaders who've been testing this, sometimes in the exact same field as you. So lean on those. And finally, your oxygen mask goes on first. So it's important that you're checking in with each other, leveraging supports and networks, connect in with your legal resources. What kind of relationships can we build with members of council? What supports do we have in terms of EFAP or beyond? Knowing what's our line in terms of how we're going to step in and take care of our team or what we're prepared to tolerate ourselves. And taking care to protect our mindset as well. So whether that's your engagement with social media, it's things that keep you centered, like movement and music or activities with, the kids, whatever that looks like, the things that help us remain centered as human beings who carry a lot of responsibility in our work. Finally, last slide. So learning is about practice, feedback, trying again, and asking for more feedback. It's not about getting it perfect the first time. So when we're learning something, it is unlikely we're going to get it perfect the first time. We want progress over perfection. Don't wait for things to be absolutely perfect before we move forward. If we start to take little steps forward, that's what's going to help give us the progress we need. Our employees deserve to be safe and respected at work, and we have a responsibility to help make that happen. So with that, I'd like to, my last slide, thank you all. I would love to see if we have any questions or comments. I think we've got a few minutes before we wrap up our time.
Thanks, Sandra. If anyone on the call has any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself. We'll give you a minute here.
And I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you again, Kelly and AORS, for the chance to be part of your National Public Works Week and talk about this really important topic. So thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm not hearing or seeing anyone come off mute. So I do want to take the time, Sandra, again, to thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's great to see the survey results that we're seeing show up on the screen and have some real life takeaways that we can take back to municipalities and really create that culture where it isn't seen as part of the job, having to deal with the abuse and harassment and interference that we're seeing. Just for everybody on here, we are recording. I will send out a YouTube link at the end of the week after all of our webinars are done. I will give you a copy of this as well as Sandra's presentation. And I'll also provide in that the link to the survey. And I do encourage you to get all of your frontline staff to fill out that survey. As Sandra said, we are trying to advocate to the province for changes, for meaningful changes that will make a difference difference in municipal public works across the province. But we do need this data in order to make that happen. And so having those survey results is very important for us to have. It'll also be, if you're coming to the trade show in a couple of weeks, we'll have the QR codes at the trade show and encourage everyone there to fill out the survey as well. So thank you again for your time, Sandra, and thank everyone for joining us. And if you are able, we have one more webinar left this week. We have the Ministry of Transportation joining us tomorrow to talk about the harmonization of municipal standards at 1 o'clock. So we hope to see everyone then. So with that, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Have a great day, everyone.